Okay, today we're going to be looking at a computer that I believe is underappreciated. In fact, not only underappreciated, but hated on, and they don't believe it, or but deserve it. Mute this. However, what was I saying? Oh yeah, the computers that I believe are underappreciated. And that is these old eMachines. So, if you're unfamiliar with eMachines, these were like the cheapest computers you could buy for quite a while. They started out, I think, in the 90s. I don't think they were around any earlier than that. And they were made by a company called Trigem Computers Incorporated. And yes, those earlier systems, the ones from the 90s, I have one, I can't get to it right now. The ones that said never obsolete on the front, those were kind of junky, but they got a lot of people who otherwise couldn't afford to own a computer into a computer that was functional and would work for a while and do what it was designed to do, for the most part. I'm not talking about those machines, so I'm going to talk about this era machine, which, if you ask me, are actually pretty decent computers. Now, unfortunately, this computer met a fate that I'd say a lot of these end up meeting. If you're anything familiar with these old eMachines, you'll know the power supplies in these machines, I should have saved it. The ones that came in these machines is the Bestec ATX 250 12E. It's a 250 watt power supply, and it uses a 2 transistor 5 volt standby rail. Well, there's some capacitors that start failing, and there's not proper protection on that power supply, so it'll end up sending high voltage spikes, and by high voltage I mean like 12 or 13 volts, but it's still pretty high compared to the 5 volts, through the 5 volt standby rail and fry the motherboard. And at that point, you need a new power supply and a new motherboard, and the computer is basically not worth fixing. It's very unfortunate. However, that is what happens. Now, I am the kind of crazy, optimistic, or maybe just plain old stupid person who goes ahead and buys a new motherboard for one of these to replace it. You can see I've put a new motherboard in this system, and I've replaced the power supply from the ATX 250 12E to a Bestec ATX 250 12Z, which is basically the same power supply, but it came in a HP or compact machine. It's just the 12E versus the 12Z, and the 12E uses a different style 5 volt standby rail. This one does not have the same fault that those have. Of course, if you get a machine with that Bestec ATX 250 12E power supply and it is still running, replace that power supply. Power supplies are cheap. You can go buy an ATX 250 12Z like this one, or really any ATX power supply. You can probably find a decent one for under $20, especially if you search up one of these on eBay or something, or maybe you have one you harvested from something else. You don't need a fancy, modern, new power supply. It just has to have a 20-pin and a 4-pin connector, and that's it. So, the newer ones I should mention with the Bestec ATX 300 12E, and I do have one of those, those are not a problem. Anyway, this machine's been upgraded somewhat, and this brings me to the point of why I don't think these machines are terrible. People seem to say, oh yeah, those are cheap, those are junk, da-da-da-da-da. And unfortunately, I think that power supply blowing up and taking out the motherboards, which I will admit is a large problem, is part of the reason why these have such a bad reputation for being cheap junk. But if that power supply was no longer in here, and the newer models that didn't have that power supply weren't affected by this problem, you have a system that, yes, when it was new, this machine, this is a T-2792, it only had a 2.7 gigahertz Intel Celeron processor. It only had an 80 gigabyte hard drive, and it only had 256 megabytes of RAM. However, unlike today, where you buy a lower-end desktop, or even some higher-end desktops, and everything is soldered onto the board. You have a CPU you can't upgrade. You have a lot of times RAM you can't upgrade, although most of them you can still upgrade the RAM, but a lot of times it'll be laptop RAM. You'll have a laptop hard drive, a laptop disk drive. Everything is laptop components now, or non-standardized in some way. This machine uses all standard parts. This is a standard disk drive, although it does have a different front panel. You can put a standard disk drive in there. Standard power supply. It has standard PCIe, or sorry, those are just PCI. This is an old system. Takes standard RAM, has a socketed processor. It's a 478 socket processor. You can upgrade the hard drive. These machines are upgradable. They are serviceable. So if you wanted to upgrade that CPU, which I did in this machine, from that Celeron to, say, a 2.8 gigahertz Pentium 4, which will give it quite a bit more speed, I did that. I upgraded the RAM from 256 megabytes to 2 gigabytes. I've installed a Sound Blaster Audigy 4, mainly because this board that I bought, even though it's the same exact part number, it's a slightly earlier revision. And this one has a front panel audio header here, where this one doesn't. So I installed this sound card so I can connect my front panel audio up. But the point is, you've got expansion slots, you've got spot for another hard drive, you've got plenty of connectors on this board. Hell, this is a standard ATX case, and if you wanted to, you could put a modern motherboard in here. Just pop the I/O shield out, new power supply, whatever. It's a micro ATX case. In this case, this isn't cheap, flimsy metal like the modern ones. This is pretty decent metal. I've seen worse metal on higher end systems from the same time period. Cough, cough, Dell, HP. HP is pretty bad at that. So, yeah, these aren't high-end machines, but they're upgradable. They're reliable, except for this power supply, but if you replace that, which is like $20 at the most, you have a very solid machine. Now, I've gone for the full thing. I've got the eMachines speakers here, and I quite like these. They're manufactured by Diamond Audio, and I still have I use a pair of these speakers. This is the USB-powered version. I use a pair of the wall wart-powered version on my main system. So here's the ports on the back. Of course, we've got this sound card installed, and you can see here, eMachines T2792, manufactured by Tri-Gym Computers. So this is before Gateway bought eMachines. And, you know, it's cheap, but it's really not that cheaply made. These motherboards, a lot of these use Intel-made boards, although this one appears to be an actual Tri-Gym manufactured board. So we'll go ahead and power this guy up. This is a slightly old not version. Oh yeah, it's an old version of Windows XP. Yeah, right. It's an old install of Windows XP, so it's not exactly the fastest. It's running on an old IDE hard drive. If I didn't mention it, this does have a nice little door here. It's got high-speed USB 2.0 on the front. It was high-speed when it was new. It's got a microphone, headphone. You know, it's pretty decent. This is a DVD drive for the time. That was pretty good. And we'll go ahead and look at the specs here. This is Windows XP Professional, Service Pack 3. Here we go, 2.8 gigahertz Pentium 4, 2 gigabytes of RAM. The display adapter in this machine is an Intel graphics. It's just a basic Intel graphics. Unfortunately, this machine does not have any sort of AGP. It wouldn't be PCIe at the time. It would be AGP, but it does not have an AGP slot, so you're pretty much stuck with the onboard graphics unless you want to use a PCI card. But the onboard graphics, for the kind of person who was going to buy an eMachines, they're not going to be doing any gaming or graphics intensive work. They're going to be doing basic, computer work. And honestly, even in 2022, or no, this is 2023, for basic computer work, with this being upgraded to this new Pentium 4 and 2 gigs of RAM, it's still usable. Intel Pentium 4, socket 478. Main board, as you can see, it's manufactured by Tri-Gem Computer Incorporated, but it does have Intel chipset, of course. There's our 2 gigabytes of memory and our Intel graphics. Like I said, still a completely usable computer, even in 2023. Although if you were actually using this as like an actual computer, I would probably recommend running some sort of lightweight version of Linux and not Windows XP, simply because, as much as I love Windows XP, if you just need a computer and if you don't actually care, I would recommend not using XP. It's just, it is, I don't want to say outdated, because honestly it still works just fine. It's kind of, unless you want to play around with things, like there's a lot of software that won't work on its latest version. You got to find a workaround. But it still works. But this computer will run it's 32-bit only. It'll run, I don't know, Debian 32-bit, something like that. I don't know if it's gonna play YouTube, but we'll try. This is probably gonna be a struggle for it. Although, with a lightweight version of Linux, it would probably be okay for playing YouTube. It loaded. Let's see. Let's try playing a video. Yeah, this is a 20-year-old computer, guys. It's actually doing pretty good for how old it is. It's taking its time, but it's still, it's doing it. It's probably not going to play the video worth an absolute shit, but...
Today's translucent Bandai Blue shenanigans are brought to you by Squarespace.
Okay, let's be especially mean to it.
More on that in a bit. This is a 1998 Bandai Blue iMac.
It's actually...
Revision B. In my opinion,
it's horrible, but let's go down to a lower... Yeah, 480p, you don't need that. Try 144 and see what it does.
Tray loading iMac G3s, but this one is a bit sick.
Hell, put a better graphics card in here. I think it would run it if you could. There's some decent PCI graphics cards. You could use it. You could do it. If you're not doing that stuff, if you're just using it for basic computer stuff, I don't know, checking your email and stuff like that. I better not open my email on the camera. That's asking for trouble. Point being, it's still a usable machine in 2023. I'm not recommending you use it. I'm not recommending you get one of these if you just want a computer to use, because it's incredibly outdated, and for probably around $50 you can get a machine that'll run circles around this. But my point is that these old eMachines, they're not the best systems you can get. They're not the best systems you could get at the time, for sure. But they weren't the worst. And honestly, I don't think they deserve all the hate that they get. They're decent machines. They're upgradable. They're quite reliable if you replace that power supply, which, once again, isn't a big deal. And not all of them came with that power supply. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.